Good evening and welcome to the fifth debate of term. The motion tonight is this House would be a free speech absolutist, which is very pertinent considering the chamber we're sat in tonight and our history of commitment to free speech. Tonight we'll be delving into more of what this commitment entails and if there's limits to such a commitment. To briefly reiterate the rules, it's your prerogative as members to interrupt paper speakers tonight and say point of information, but it's equally the prerogative of our 6 paper speakers to continue with their speech and deny your point of information. We'll have a proposition and opposition speaker, followed by a round of floor speeches, and that format will be repeated twice more. Floor speeches are your time as members to commit to a 1 to 2 minute speech where you can make your voice heard, and we'll have that after every 2 paper speakers. So, without further ado, our first speaker of the evening is Edward Foley. Edward Foley is a master's student from Queen's. You have the ears of the House.
Fire, 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 fire. Now you've heard it. Not shouted in a crowded theatre exactly, but you get the point. It's very often forgotten the phrase comes from the judgment of the US Supreme Court and from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who, when asked for a natural example of when it might be right to limit freedom of speech, to criminalise it, in fact, gave that of shouting fire in a crowded theatre. It's more often forgotten that what the Supreme Court was doing in that case was sending to prison a group of socialist anti-war activists and allowing the government to imprison people for speaking out against US involvement in the First World War. The socialist anti-war activists had been caught handing out pamphlets opposing the military draft and urging people not to submit to it. In fact, it could be just as plausibly argued that the socialist anti-war activists jailed by the Supreme Court were the real firefighters, were the ones shouting fire when there really was a fire, in a very crowded theatre indeed. And who is to decide? Some of you may recall this story from a speech by Christopher Hitchens, very much the model of a free speech absolutist. Hitchens' point was that claiming that certain speech is harmful can be used, indeed often has been used, to justify suppressing any speech that is unpopular. Who gets to decide what speech is harmful? Keep that question, ladies and gentlemen, before your minds. What does it mean to be a free speech absolutist? It means that all individuals should have the right to express their opinions without interference, censorship, or legal penalty. It means to believe that all ideas, regardless of how controversial, offensive, or harmful they may be, should be permitted in the public domain. And it means to believe that the best mechanism for addressing false, hateful, or harmful speech is more speech, is to debate and refute rather than prohibit. However, to be a free speech absolutist is not to believe that all opinions are equally valid, or that we should give platforms to every speaker, nor does it require us to excuse speech that crosses a clear line from genuine expression to targeted harassment or direct threats against an individual, or to protect speech that is part of a distinct crime. There are, of course, many cases beyond this. Examples that I'm sure you'll hear raised tonight where our first instinct might be to wish to prevent speech we believe is harmful. Why would we not want to stop the rantings of bigots, of white supremacists, of homophobes, of transphobes, and those of that stripe? On this side of the House, our case is that free speech rights are indivisible. When we grant the government the power to suppress speech, we all become subject to censorship. Every time you propose to violate the free speech of someone else, you are making a rod for your own back. That may be fine if you sit in the safely moral majority. Speech that is popular is not at risk of being silenced. It is minority views, even those that we might consider offensive, that require protection. So yes, we should defend speech that offends us, because if otherwise, we are not defending free speech at all. This was put best, I think, by Rosa Luxemburg, who said that the freedom of speech is meaningless unless it means the freedom of the person who thinks differently. We live in a time where freedom of speech is under attack from reactionary, authoritarian, populist forces. Russia has criminalized opposition to the war. Hungary has undermined the independent media. Authorities in Hong Kong have stifled dissent and snuffed out the last flicker of democracy. But there are also progressive forces calling for a new kind of censorship, one which appears virtuous and claims to protect the interests of the vulnerable. Both of these forces are threats to free speech, and both of them must be opposed. The classic case for freedom of speech is that it is essential to the pursuit of truth and the very fabric of a free society. And in this chamber, we must be reminded that there is a great tradition of liberty that fought for the right of free speech. And it's easy to forget that it was a fight. The history of liberalism is a history of people who campaigned against censorship in order to advance ideas that were met with skepticism and often hostility, but that we now regard as self-evident. Moral and scientific progress can only occur when ideas that were initially viewed as radical evolve through the weight of argument and evidence into accepted truths. The philosopher Will MacAskill talks about how moral weirdos, individuals who were willing to take up unpopular views, have been instigators of moral progress. Take the abolitionist movement. For most of human history, slavery was legally permitted almost everywhere. In 1700, about 3/4 of the world's population were enslaved. MacAskill gives the example of Benjamin Lay, one of the early abolitionists in Pennsylvania. Lay was a Quaker, and he gained a reputation for engaging in guerrilla activism because he so deeply opposed slave owning. He would shout and harass slave owners at Quaker meetings, get kicked out, and then lay down in the doorway so that everyone leaving the meeting had to walk over him. It was moral weirdos like Lay and those that followed him who were ultimately successful in convincing society to change its laws and attitudes towards slavery. And it is as certain now, as it was 160 years ago when John Stuart Mill made this very point, that many of the things that we regard and believe to be true will be rejected by future generations. That just as we reject many of the ideas that were once widely accepted, to recognize the risk of censoring unpopular opinions, therefore, is to recognize the overwhelming evidence of human fallibility. However, we're not saying that all opinions are equally valid, or that everyone is always acting in good faith. Some of the opinions we hear, of course, are nasty, incoherent bullshit. But silencing any opinion robs us of the clearer understanding of truth that emerges from the clash of different views. Time spent arguing is, oddly enough, almost never wasted.
On that point.
No, thank you. All right, then, go ahead.
And that's my point exactly, actually. You alluded to earlier in your speech saying that we don't have to give everyone a platform, and yet now you're saying silencing even, let's say, the most hateful, racist remarks possible is silencing free speech. So how are you going to decide who you allow to platform or not? And how is that not going to be based on them using that silencing free speech?
We don't think that there's an equal right to give people different platforms and say that we have to say that all speech is equal. But we do have to draw a clear line when it comes to silencing people, and draw a clear line as to what the conduct of the government is and the nature of our laws. And I think that really sets the clear standard that is accepted by the rest of society, or sets a principle in which all of us can then hopefully be more welcome and open to different perspectives. And I think we should very much take that view on board today. But I think we do live in an age very different from Mill's, an age where the internet and social media have caused an explosion of information, an age where lies and deepfakes might shake our confidence in the value of free speech. But the true value of free speech lies in the belief that reason and debate are the most formidable weapons against error, that lies and misinformation lose their power when we are freely able to contradict them. And it should be obvious to us now that attempting to repress harmful speech by censorship is not effective. Censorship only drives fringe views out of the public square and down the rabbit hole. And these shadowy echo chambers only foster radicalization and also encourage the spread of even more extreme views. Moreover, the act of censorship often draws attention to the very ideas it seeks to suppress. Rather than eliminating harmful speech, censorship can actually amplify it. But perhaps more importantly, if your view is that harmful misinformation should be censored, then who gets to decide what amounts to misinformation? For example, should we not censor Trump's appalling lies about the 2020 election? Do you know there's actually a term for liars like Trump? Just hopefully not two terms. But what happens if he does gain power and you've weakened the protections for free speech and Trump starts punishing dissent, anything that he considers a lie? What happens when you've built that trap for yourself? But free speech is also under attack from progressive forces, those that have twisted themselves into a posture of self-censorship to protect people from the risk of discomfort and offence. And of course, that risk of discomfort and offence is very real. But we do have to make a choice about what is most important to protect. About 18 months ago, Salman Rushdie was beginning a talk at a literary festival in upstate New York when an attacker leapt up on stage and stabbed him repeatedly. An attack which had been threatened for more than 33 years. You will recall, of course, that in 1989, the Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran gave Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses, perhaps the single worst review any novelist has ever had, calling for his death and also for the killing of everyone involved in its publication. Still to this day, there are many who argue that Rushdie got what he deserved for insulting a great religion, that he committed crimes of blasphemy and offence, and that ultimately books like the Satanic Verses shouldn't be protected speech. What is it that we're willing to protect? Do we protect the freedom to write ironically and irreverently, the freedom to criticize religion, even to make fun of it? Or do we protect those who are determined to be offended? Those who would burn embassies and assassinate journalists for publishing cartoons? In the aftermath of the attack, Rushdie wrote about the value of free expression and the question of what we should do about free speech when it is so widely abused. We should still do, Rushdie wrote, what we've always needed to do: to answer bad speech with better speech, to counter false narratives with better narratives, to answer hate with love, and to believe that the truth can still succeed in an age of lies. Thank you.